The town of Briar Hollow looked exactly the way people imagined Christmas was supposed to look, especially to those who had never lived there long enough to understand its silences. Snow fell gently but without mercy, covering old sins and fresh footprints with the same clean white lie. Garland hung from lampposts along Main Street. A plastic nativity scene glowed beside the courthouse steps. Everything suggested safety, tradition, and return. That illusion was why Daniel Mercer came home. Daniel had left Briar Hollow 12 years earlier with a duffel bag, a fractured jaw, and a promise he made to himself that he would never come back. He built a new life 2 states away, one where no one asked questions about his family or the winter he vanished. But Christmas has a way of reopening doors people believe they have sealed shut. His mother's phone call came 3 weeks before the holiday, her voice brittle with practiced cheer. "Just for a few days," she said. "Your father's not well. It would mean so much." Daniel agreed before he finished thinking. He told himself he was older now, stronger, that the past had lost its grip. He packed lightly, stayed vague about his return with friends, and drove through the snowstorm alone, headlights carving narrow tunnels through darkness that felt familiar in a way he didn't like. Briar Hollow welcomed him back without ceremony. The town sign still leaned slightly to the left. The gas station still smelled like burnt coffee. The same houses sat shoulder to shoulder along Maple Lane, pretending time had passed without changing anything important. As Daniel pulled into his parents' driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, as if the house had been waiting. Inside, the warmth felt heavy. His mother hugged him too tightly, her hands lingering on his back as though confirming he was real. His father nodded from the recliner, thinner than Daniel remembered, eyes sharp but distant. Nothing was said about the argument that had driven Daniel away all those years ago. In Briar Hollow, difficult conversations were treated like storms, endured quietly and forgotten once they passed. But storms, Daniel knew, never really disappeared. They just moved underground. The first sign that coming home had been a mistake arrived the next morning. Daniel walked into Turner's Market to pick up groceries, the same bell above the door announcing him as it always had. Conversations stalled, eyes lifted. Recognition spread in quick, silent ripples. Someone muttered his name. Someone else looked away too fast. Mrs. Turner herself rang him up without meeting his gaze. "Back for the holidays?" she asked, as if the answer mattered. "Just visiting," said Daniel. Her lips pressed together. "That's nice." It wasn't. By afternoon, Daniel noticed the looks turned into something heavier, not curiosity, but expectation, as if his return completed a pattern the town had been waiting on. Old neighbors waved with stiff smiles. A former classmate crossed the street to avoid him. A man Daniel barely recognized spat into the snow as he passed. No one said why. That night, Daniel received the first message. It wasn't a text or a call. It was a knock at the door just after midnight. 3 sharp raps, then silence. When Daniel opened it, no one stood on the porch. Only a small gift bag rested against the doorframe, its red handles dusted with snow. Inside was a bottle of cheap whiskey and a folded note. "Good to have you home." No signature. Daniel didn't sleep. Christmas Eve brought more visitors, some expected, some not. An aunt he barely remembered arrived with cookies and nervous laughter. A childhood friend stopped by, asked polite questions, left quickly. And then, just before dusk, someone Daniel never expected to see again stood in the doorway. Mark Holloway. Mark had been the last person Daniel spoke to before leaving Briar Hollow for good. They had grown up together, shared trouble, shared blame, and eventually shared a secret that no one else ever acknowledged openly. Mark smiled now the same way he used to, too casual, eyes sharp with calculation. "Heard you were back," Mark said. "Thought I'd say hello." They talked in the kitchen while Daniel's parents pretended not to listen. Mark joked about old times, about how quiet the town had become. Then his tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "Funny thing about coming home," Mark said. "Sometimes the past expects repayment." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't owe anyone anything." Mark's smile thinned. "That's not how everyone remembers it." When Mark left, Daniel felt the house exhale in relief. Snow began falling harder after dark, thick, relentless. Roads disappeared beneath white drifts. Power flickered once, twice, then steadied. The storm wrapped Briar Hollow in isolation, sealing it off from the outside world. Perfect conditions for unfinished business. The final knock came late, closer to midnight than Daniel liked. His parents were asleep. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock and the wind pressing against the walls. Daniel opened the door to find Mark again, snow clinging to his coat, breath visible in the cold. "Roads are bad," Mark said. "Thought I'd wait it out here." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct told him not to let Mark inside, but Briar Hollow taught him long ago that refusing hospitality came with consequences. He stepped aside. That decision would be his last. By morning, the visitor who came home for the holidays would never leave alive, and Briar Hollow would once again prove that Christmas doesn't forgive, it remembers. That was the strangest part. By the time Mark Holloway stepped fully inside the Mercer house, the world beyond the walls had gone quiet, as if Briar Hollow itself had been wrapped in thick cotton. Wind pressed against the windows, but it felt distant, muted. The storm had done what storms in that town always did. It cut people off from help, from witnesses, from escape. Daniel locked the door behind Mark without thinking. Habit. Reflex. A mistake he realized too late. Mark stamped snow from his boots and glanced around the living room like a man reacquainting himself with familiar territory. The same framed family photos, the same worn sofa, the same faint smell of pine cleaner and old wood. "Feels like nothing ever changes here," Mark said. Daniel didn't answer. He watched Mark carefully, noting the way his eyes kept drifting to the hallway that led to the bedrooms, the stairs, the back door. This wasn't a friendly visit, it was reconnaissance. "You staying long?" Daniel asked. Mark shrugged off his coat. "Depends on the weather and how welcoming folks feel." Daniel poured 2 glasses of whiskey, more to keep his hands busy than out of hospitality. He handed one to Mark, who accepted it with a knowing smile. "To being home," Mark said. Daniel didn't toast. They sat across from each other, the space between them thick with things unsaid. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. Somewhere, upstairs, Daniel's father coughed in his sleep. His mother shifted in bed, unaware, uninvolved, protected for now. Mark leaned back, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You know," he said casually, "people still talk." Daniel's jaw tightened. "About what?" Mark chuckled softly. "About that winter. About what happened to Luke." The name hit like a blow. Luke Garner was 17, angry, reckless. He disappeared the same night Daniel left town. The official story had always been simple, runaway. But everyone in Briar Hollow knew better, and everyone had chosen not to know. "I didn't come back to relive this," Daniel said. Mark's eyes hardened. Funny, because it never stopped for me. The storm intensified. Snow slammed against the windows now, no longer gentle. The lights flickered again, briefly dimming the room. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. "What do you want, Mark?" Daniel asked. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Closure." Daniel laughed bitterly. "You think closure comes knocking at midnight?" Mark's smile vanished. "I think debts do." The argument they had avoided for 12 years finally surfaced, ugly and unavoidable. Mark accused Daniel of abandoning him, of leaving him alone to deal with the fallout. Daniel accused Mark of pushing Luke too far, of losing control. "You were there," Mark snapped. "You helped." "I tried to stop it," Daniel shot back. "But you didn't, and when it went bad, you ran." Silence filled the room, broken only by the storm and the ticking clock. Mark stood and began pacing, agitation seeping through his controlled exterior. He talked about the years since, the jobs he couldn't keep, the relationships that failed, the whispers that followed him everywhere in Briar Hollow. "They look at me like a monster, like I did something unforgivable." Daniel swallowed. "You did." Mark stopped pacing. Slowly, he turned. "So did you." The lights went out. Not flickered, not dimmed. Out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and sudden. The house groaned as the heating system shut down. Wind roared outside, louder now without the hum of electricity to compete. Daniel stood abruptly. "I'll check the breaker." "Bad idea," Mark said. Daniel ignored him, moving toward the hallway. He didn't get far. Mark grabbed him from behind, shoving him hard into the wall. Daniel's shoulder struck wood with a dull crack. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. "Don't walk away again," Mark hissed. They struggled in the dark, bodies colliding with furniture, the sound of the fight muffled by the storm. Daniel managed to break free, backing away, breath ragged. "Get out, now." Mark laughed, the sound unhinged. "You don't get to decide that anymore." A loud thump echoed upstairs. Daniel's father shifting, restless but still asleep. Daniel lowered his voice instinctively. "This doesn't end the way you think." Mark stepped closer. "It ends the only way it can." The argument escalated, years of resentment pouring out unchecked. Mark accused Daniel of letting him take the blame, of leaving town knowing full well Luke's disappearance would follow Mark like a shadow. Daniel fired back that Mark had enjoyed the power, the control, until it went too far. "You scared him," Daniel said. "You always did." Mark's breathing grew heavy. He deserved it. That was when Daniel knew there was no reasoning left. The struggle resumed, more desperate now. They crashed into the dining table, knocking over chairs. Something shattered. Glass, maybe. A picture frame. Daniel barely noticed. His focus narrowed to survival. Mark reached for something on the counter, a heavy ceramic mug. He swung it wildly. Daniel ducked, felt it graze his shoulder. Pain exploded. He stumbled, vision blurring. In the chaos, Mark slipped. The back door stood just a few feet away, snow blowing in through the cracks. Mark lost his footing on the icy floor near the entryway. He fell hard, striking his head against the edge of the counter. The sound was sickening. Mark lay still, heart hammering in his chest. Daniel knelt beside him, shaking him. "Mark?" he whispered. No response. Blood pooled beneath Mark's head, dark and spreading fast. Daniel's hands trembled as he checked for a pulse. It was there, faint, irregular, weakening. Panic set in. The phone was useless, no signal, the landline dead with the power. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the road, erasing tracks. Daniel stood, pacing frantically. He considered waking his parents, calling for help that didn't exist. He considered running. Mark groaned softly, eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "You don't get to leave," he whispered. Then his eyes closed. Mark Holloway never regained consciousness. By the time dawn crept weakly through the frost-covered windows, the visitor who came home for the holidays was dead. And Daniel Mercer stood alone in a house full of witnesses, facing a truth he could no longer outrun. The morning after the storm left Briar Hollow buried in silence, Daniel Mercer stood frozen in his living room. Mark Holloway's body was still sprawled near the entryway, the pale light of dawn catching the pooling blood and casting long, accusing shadows across the floorboards. Daniel's parents stirred upstairs, oblivious to the chaos just a few feet away, their muffled movements carrying a grim irony. Life carried on, unaware of death waiting in the hall. Panic clawed at Daniel. He couldn't call anyone. The storm had cut the town off. Cell service was spotty at best, and the landline was dead. He considered moving the body, hiding the evidence, pretending that Mark had left like any other visitor. But even in the adrenaline-fueled haze, he knew hiding a death wasn't an option, not in a town like Briar Hollow. Secrets always leak out, no matter how deep you bury them. Hours passed before a neighbor finally noticed the Mercer driveway. Marge Connolly, who lived across the street, had walked over to check on them after seeing smoke rise unevenly from the chimney. She found Daniel pacing near the kitchen, his face pale, eyes wild. "Daniel, what happened?" Marge asked, her voice tight with concern. He hesitated, words caught in his throat. It was an accident," he finally said. "He fell, hit his head. The storm, it trapped us." Marge studied him, suspicion flickering behind her worry. "You're saying Mark Holloway is—" Daniel swallowed. "Dead. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." Marge's eyes widened. She nodded slowly. "I'll call the sheriff, but you need to stay calm. We can't make this worse." By noon, Sheriff Harlan Briggs arrived, accompanied by 2 deputies. The snowstorm had slowed their travel, but the law eventually reached every corner of Briar Hollow. They entered cautiously, aware of the tension thickening the warm air inside the house. Daniel explained what had happened, voice trembling. Sheriff Briggs listened carefully, eyes narrowing. "Stay here," Briggs instructed. "We'll handle it." Inside, the deputies began photographing the scene. Daniel noticed the same details Cole would notice in a later investigation: the ceramic mug on the floor, the displaced chairs, the blood trail toward the door, and the open whiskey bottle. Each element suggested struggle, panic, and sudden collapse. Yet there were questions that no photo could answer. Why had Mark Holloway come back to the house after so many years? What had he truly wanted? And most importantly, why now? As the sheriff cataloged the scene, Daniel's father, seated in his recliner, watched quietly, understanding more than he admitted. His mother shivered in the corner, clutching a blanket. Neither expected a Christmas to end this way. For the investigators, the case was immediately complex. Mark Holloway had a history in Briar Hollow, but recent years painted him as a man with no pressing enemies. Daniel Mercer, on the other hand, had returned after a long absence with a murky past. The storm created an alibi of sorts, but it also trapped potential witnesses. Everyone in the house was a potential source, yet their own shock made statements unreliable. Sheriff Briggs made the call to the county coroner, and it wasn't long before Dr. Emily Kavanaugh arrived. She noted the obvious: head trauma consistent with blunt force, evidence of a struggle, and a body that had been unattended for several hours. "This isn't going to be simple," she told the sheriff. "We'll need to consider both accident and foul play." By late afternoon, news began to seep out. Neighbors whispered. Children played in the snow, unaware of the adult secrets that had unraveled behind closed doors. Every resident of Briar Hollow had a stake in what happened that night. For some, fear. For others, curiosity. For all, the realization that the past isn't as quiet as it seems. As evening fell, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, replaying the night over and over. The storm had isolated him, but now the outside world was slowly creeping in, demanding answers he didn't have. He knew the investigation would be inevitable, and with it, the truth of what happened inside that house on Christmas Eve would begin to unravel. Because in a town like Briar Hollow, silence cannot last forever. The storm might hide a body for a few hours, maybe even a day, but it cannot hide a story. And this story of old friends, unresolved guilt, and a Christmas that turned deadly was about to be told. By the morning after the storm, Briar Hollow had begun to stir, though the usual warmth of the holidays was replaced with tension. Word had spread fast. Mark Holloway was dead, and Daniel Mercer had been the last person seen with him. Whispers followed him through the snow-dusted streets, eyes tracking him as he moved from his parents' house to the local diner, each step measured, each glance judged. The town had a long memory, and Christmas had never been kind to its ghosts. Detective Aaron Cole, called in from the county, arrived with a measured sense of purpose. He had seen cases like this before: isolated towns, a storm cutting off contact, a death that appeared accidental but was wrapped in the weight of history. Cole immediately began cataloging the scene, questioning the family, and reviewing statements. Daniel recounted the night repeatedly. Each version grew more precise, more controlled, as if rehearsing words might somehow shield him from suspicion. But Cole was thorough. He observed Daniel's movements, the timeline, the inconsistencies. Even the smallest ones mattered. "You were alone with him?" Cole asked, voice calm, precise. "Yes," Daniel replied, throat tight. I tried to get him to leave. He wouldn't." "And the storm?" Cole pressed. "It trapped both of you." Daniel nodded, whether he was convincing himself or the detective. It did." Cole made note of the open whiskey bottle, the broken ceramic mug, the scuffed floorboards. There was no sign of forced entry, no outside footprints beyond the initial snow. This suggested an altercation confined to the house. But Cole knew better. Motive could make walls invisible, and trust was a fragile door. Meanwhile, Briar Hollow had taken notice. Neighbors who had previously ignored the Mercers now came forward, offering fragments of memory, unspoken suspicions, and stories from years past. Someone remembered Mark's sudden disappearances. Someone else recalled a fight between the two friends in their youth. Patterns began to emerge, stitched together by whispers and fear. The town's memory, long dormant, was waking. At the sheriff's request, Cole reviewed Daniel's background. There were no criminal records, but the story of Luke Garner's disappearance haunted the narrative. Everyone who knew Daniel as a teenager carried their version of that night, and Cole knew those versions would shape public opinion before the trial. Inside the Mercer house, evidence collection progressed meticulously. The coroner determined Mark had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with his fall against the counter during the struggle. No weapons were found, no premeditation could be immediately confirmed, but Cole's instincts warned him that this was more than an accident. Outside, the storm had left its mark. Tire tracks and footprints were partially buried, making it difficult to reconstruct precise movements. Yet the snow also offered subtle clues. A single muddy boot print inside the entryway suggested Mark had been moving before his fall, and scuff marks along the hallway floor indicated a struggle. Cole noted them, filing mental notes for when the forensic team would return. As the investigation deepened, Daniel found himself isolated in more ways than one. The town's residents treated him with caution, polite questions layered with suspicion. Friends from childhood avoided his gaze. Even his parents' cautious encouragement could not shield him from the judgmental eyes beyond their walls. But Cole was not swayed by small-town gossip. He focused on facts: the storm, the timeline, the physical evidence, and the complex history between Daniel and Mark. Interviews with neighbors revealed subtle tensions. They always had issues, one woman said. Even as kids they fought. And then Luke, well, nobody talks about Luke anymore. Cole recognized the pattern, long-buried guilt and secrets now rising to the surface, amplified by tragedy. Every witness, every whispered story was a piece of the puzzle, and in a place like Briar Hollow, where loyalty often trumped truth, exposing the full picture would be difficult. By nightfall, Daniel returned home to a house still tinged with the storm's aftermath. Snow pressed against the windows, the silence seemed heavier, filled with anticipation. He knew the investigation would not end soon. Detective Cole's presence was a reminder that the past was no longer safe, that the choices made in darkness had consequences, and that the holiday meant nothing when death walked through your door. The town waited quietly, judging, speculating, and Daniel realized that while Mark Holloway was gone, the shadows of what had happened were only beginning to stretch across Briar Hollow, threatening to expose every secret he had ever tried to bury. Spring had not yet arrived in Briar Hollow when the trial of Daniel Mercer began, though the snowbanks were already receding into dirty gray mounds along the streets. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension and whispers. Local residents filled every available seat, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had returned for Christmas and found himself in a nightmare that ended with death. The media had not yet descended, but in a town like Briar Hollow, the courtrooms themselves felt like a stage. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, expression taut, eyes hollow but alert. Across from him, his attorney shuffled papers, murmuring quietly about procedure and strategy. The prosecuting attorney, sharp and precise, began by outlining the timeline: the storm, the visit, the struggle, and Mark Holloway's eventual death. They laid out the evidence methodically: the broken mug, the scuff marks on the floor, Daniel's testimony, the coroner's report, and the subtle traces left by the altercation. Detective Aaron Cole took the stand. His voice was calm, measured, every word deliberate. He described the sequence of events from the moment the storm trapped Daniel and Mark in the house. He spoke of the struggle, the fall, the subtle inconsistencies in initial statements, and the challenges posed by a town where everyone knew everyone else. Cole presented the evidence carefully, letting the photographs speak alongside his testimony. The broken ceramic, the pattern of blood, the boot prints all painted a picture of a night that had spun out of control. The prosecution leaned on Daniel's presence and his proximity to Mark at the moment of injury, framing the narrative as one of negligence leading to fatal consequences. They argued that Daniel's hesitation, his failure to anticipate Mark's aggression, and the chaotic struggle directly resulted in Mark Holloway's death. The narrative was simple: he had been the last person in control when life was lost. The defense, meanwhile, painted a different story. Daniel had acted out of self-preservation. He had attempted to manage a volatile situation within the constraints of the storm, the isolation, and Mark's unpredictable behavior. They emphasized years of history between the two men, arguing that the confrontation had been inevitable given unresolved guilt, long-standing tension, and the reemergence of old grievances. Testimonies from Briar Hollow residents added texture, though not clarity. Neighbors spoke of childhood fights, of whispers surrounding Luke Garner's disappearance, and of Mark's erratic behavior over the years. Some defended Daniel, noting that Mark had cultivated resentment and manipulated situations to his advantage. Others remained silent, their eyes avoiding the courtroom, unwilling to speak for fear of revealing secrets long buried under the town's carefully curated image. The defense introduced psychological testimony. An expert explained how unresolved guilt, isolation, and the pressure of returning to a town that had never forgiven could push individuals into reactive, high-stress confrontations. Daniel's reactions, they argued, were consistent with someone forced into an unavoidable struggle with a long-time antagonist during extreme circumstances. The storm, isolation, and the reemergence of past trauma created a situation where neither man could act rationally. During cross-examination, the prosecution attempted to fracture Daniel's composure, questioning every movement, every decision, every hesitation. They pressed him about his failure to act preemptively, his delayed call for help, and his history with Mark. Daniel answered carefully, measured, but each question seemed to reopen the emotional wound of that night, each memory pressed like ice against his chest. The turning point came when Detective Cole recounted the subtle evidence of self-defense. The positioning of the broken mug, the scuff marks indicating Daniel had been pushed, the absence of any intentional weapon, all suggested a struggle born of fear, confusion, and reactive instinct rather than premeditation. The jury listened intently, weighing every fact, every nuance. In Briar Hollow, where personal history and community memory often carried more weight than evidence, these details became decisive. As the trial entered its final days, the townspeople began to reckon with their own complicity. Old grudges, half-truths, and long-forgotten events came under scrutiny. The story of Luke Garner, long ignored, resurfaced in hushed conversation and courtroom testimony. It became clear that Mark Holloway had cultivated a narrative of victimhood and influence, manipulating people's memories to cast himself in a sympathetic light. Daniel, in contrast, had returned without pretense, carrying decades of unresolved guilt on his shoulders. Closing arguments emphasized moral complexity. The prosecution painted Daniel as reckless, a man whose presence had catalyzed tragedy. The defense appealed to empathy, emphasizing the storm, the isolation, Mark's aggression, and the years of psychological burden Daniel had carried. Both sides recognized the story's resonance in Briar Hollow. This was not just about one night, one death. It was about the town's history, its secrets, and the consequences of silence. After the jury retired, the courthouse settled into a tense hush. Outside, snow flurries swirled faintly, remnants of the storm that had begun months earlier. Hours passed. Townspeople lingered, speculating, imagining, fearing the verdict that would reshape the community. Children played in the remnants of snow, unaware that their town's history had just been rewritten. Finally, the jury returned. Daniel Mercer's heart pounded as the foreperson stood. On the charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant not guilty by reason of self-defense. A mixture of relief and disbelief rippled through the courtroom. Daniel sagged into his chair, letting the weight of the past few weeks wash over him. The storm, the struggle, and the frozen tension of that Christmas Eve had finally yielded clarity, not justice in its strictest sense, but acknowledgement of truth and circumstance. In the days that followed, Briar Hollow began to recover from its collective shock. The story of Mark Holloway's death and Daniel Mercer's trial became part of the town's oral history. Residents whispered about the storm, the unresolved tension, and the night a visitor never lived alive. They spoke carefully, weighing each word, knowing that even silence had consequences. Daniel returned to the Mercer house. He walked through the living room, now scrubbed clean, sunlight breaking through frost-covered windows. The remnants of the storm had melted, but the memory remained. He stood by the window, looking out at the streets, remembering the knocks, the struggle, and the quiet tension of that fateful night. His parents were still adjusting. They did not speak much of what had happened, instead focusing on rebuilding their sense of normalcy. Holidays would come again, but they would always carry the shadow of that Christmas, the lesson that old wounds and unresolved conflicts could erupt with devastating consequences. Daniel, for his part, understood something new. Returning home did not guarantee comfort, and the past could never be entirely left behind. It would always linger, waiting for the moment when circumstances, weather, and human weakness aligned to remind a town and a family of its fragile morality. The town, too, learned to reckon with the memory. Snow no longer carried innocence. The streets, though familiar, were marked by caution. Neighbors exchanged glances and soft warnings. Briar Hollow's histories have been rewritten in subtle ways. Stories told more cautiously, grudges revisited, the weight of memory no longer easily ignored. Years later, Daniel would remember that Christmas as a turning point, not for celebration, but for recognition. The visitor who never lived alive had forced the town and him to confront what many preferred to keep hidden. In the end, survival had not been about cleverness, nor about violence. It had been about understanding the fragile intersection of trust, history, and circumstance. And in the quiet nights that followed, when snow fell gently and the lights twinkled from windows untouched by fear, Daniel Mercer realized that some stories could never truly end. Briar Hollow had been changed forever, carrying the echoes of a Christmas when a visitor came and never lived alive.